This message comes from OnPoint's sponsor, Indeed. If you're hiring, with Indeed you can post a job in minutes, set up screener questions, then zero in on your short list of qualified candidates using an online dashboard. Get started at Indeed.com/NPR podcast.
From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm Meghna Chakrabarty, and this is On Point. The White House has been hammering away at China and Mexico with new tariffs and threats of even more to come. They are for vastly different reasons, of course. The president is asking Mexico to solve the migration problem, something that no single nation can solve by itself. However, the China case is different. Two powerful economies at loggerheads there. And China is firing back, warning it'll stop exporting rare earth metals to the U.S. and the world. Rare earth minerals, you ask? Well, they are 17 unusual metals with names like dysprosium and neodymium. They're critical to everything from your smartphone to washing machines to advanced weapons systems. So the Pentagon has been calling for the U.S. to ramp up domestic production as a matter of national security. This hour On Point, rare earth metals and the trade wars. You can join us. How's the White House doing, in your opinion, on trade negotiations with China? Farmers and manufacturers, consumers, are you ready to weather the consequences if it gets China to trade more fairly? And will tariffs on Mexico stop Central American migrants from crossing into the U.S.? And at the end of the hour today, we'll hear what Bill Nye, the science guy, had to tell Goucher College's graduating class of 2019 about Spaceship Earth. But first, let's get right to those trade war questions, and we'll start with Steve Liesman. He's senior economics reporter for CNBC, always a great explainer, and he joins us today from Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Steve Liesman, welcome to On Point.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Meghna.
So first of all, I just want to hear what acting White House Chief of Staff Nick Mulvaney said about those Mexican tariffs that the president threatened late last week. Mulvaney was on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace, and Wallace asked Mulvaney if the president was serious about slapping a tariff on all Mexican goods, and here's what Mulvaney said.
He's absolutely deadly serious. In fact, I fully expect these tariffs to go on to at least the 5% level on June 10th. The president is deadly serious about fixing the situation at the southern border.
So, Steve Liesman, was this announcement or threat by the president expected, or did it catch both Mexico and the U.S. off guard?
Well, only if you begin to expect random tweets slapping tariffs on other countries. That's sort of been the case. So, no, it wasn't expected by the markets. It wasn't expected by me. I guess we got an inkling of something big happening in some sort of announcement that Thursday morning, but everybody was taken by surprise, including, I believe, some of his advisors as well, who didn't know this was coming for sure, and some of whom internally had argued against this move.
Like the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States.
Yeah, and also his top trade advisor had argued against this because we have, among other things, a deal with Mexico in front of Congress right now.
Oh, right. That being the revamped, I guess we have to call it the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement.
USMCA, if you want to save some time.
Okay. Well, top officials from Mexico and the U.S. are meeting today to try to fend off these threatened tariffs. But what exactly could they do? I mean, the president has said Mexico has to solve the migration problem there.
Yeah, and so your question is a good one because it shows you the weird world we're in right now, which is I don't know what they could do to solve the migration problem. I can talk about the impact of tariffs. I can talk about perhaps the unfair trade practices by China. I can talk about the relative advantage that one country has over another. But I don't know about that, and a lot of people don't know about that, and whether the linkage of the two. You're using trade policy here in order to affect another national security issue, if you want to call it, or you can call it a migration issue. So what they can do, I don't know. But the effects of tariffs, I can tell you, you have a lot of economists now that are pretty darn sure that a recession is in the offing if these tariffs go into effect.
Tell us more about why.
So there's a lot of different ways that tariffs will affect the economy. But in the case of Mexico, it's especially complicated because we have this very elaborate and complicated supply chain in place where goods go down from the United States into Mexico. They're processed down there a bit. They come back, And in some cases, they may go back again to Mexico. If you think about some of the ways that some of the car parts are put together. We do call it $350 billion a year of imports from Mexico, some of which are things that had been partially already exported and back and forth to Mexico. So what you're talking about is slapping at the 25% level, this go up 5% a month, something like $87 or $90 billion worth of new taxes, raising prices, increasing uncertainty, and really messing up the supply chain as we know it for a lot of U.S. companies.
Well, I imagine that the automotive industry, to say the least, is having perhaps heart palpitations right now because, as you pointed out, their supply chain crosses back and forth over the border multiple times for every single automobile ultimately assembled in the United States. So is the White House getting pushback from members of the business community in this country? Yes,
they are. In fact, the Business Roundtable, a collection of some of the biggest companies in the in the nation, have protested against this. The Chamber of Commerce has. Many people have. Everybody agrees it'd be great to do something about the immigration issue, but they're very concerned about linking it. And there are so many ways this almost works against the purpose of the president here. If you think about the negative impact this could have on the Mexican economy, you could create people who have more incentive to cross the border. And then you think about the Mexican economy being an important economy for those nations to the south, where a lot of the migrants are coming from. So you would worsen the economic situation there and create more migration issues coming up. Now, maybe this does prompt the Mexicans to deal with it administratively inside their country, but I think you're the one that you led this segment with something that nobody has been able to do, hence 2/4 here.
All right. So, Steve, I mean, one thing one might say about the president is that his negotiating strategy is to ask for everything, maybe get something in return and call it a victory. That's not an unusual tactic. But I just want to – we've been focusing on Mexico. I just want to briefly ask you before I have to let you go here. Obviously, the other major issue of tariffs has to do with China. So, I mean, do you think for the U.S. economy, perhaps you've already answered this, but is opening a two-front trade war, is it sustainable for the economy?
I mean, I guess it is. I mean, I guess we have enough wealth in this country to withstand it. The question becomes, are we willing to risk a recession? Are we willing to risk a slower growth? We already were basically forecasting slower growth in this country. Most economists had that penciled in. The Federal Reserve had that penciled in. Now you're adding on top of that. And what's happened here is that the probability of a recession next year, according to one survey that just came out, has now skyrocketed to 60%. Markets are now building in multiple rate cuts from the Federal Reserve. What's the way these things sort of work together where it becomes difficult is China and Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. just signed a trade agreement. And now this additional request from the president for solving the migration problem in exchange for a threat of new tariffs. People think the Chinese are going to look at that and say, well, wait a second. If I make a deal with the president now on this, what's to stop him from coming back and asking for something later? And one of the things that I guess we were requesting in those Chinese negotiations was the ability to slap tariffs on unilaterally whenever we felt like it. And this is a big change in the global trading regime, which was essentially adjudicated by independent third parties through the World Trade Organization and in other ways. And the president wants to change that regime as it's set up now.
Well, Steve Liesman, senior economics reporter for CNBC. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, let's listen to a little bit more of what the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, talked about regarding these tariffs on Chinese imports, and a 25% tariff on many goods now coming into the United States, to seaports in the United States as of Saturday. He spoke to Fox Business's Maria Bartiromo on Friday and had this to say about the ongoing trade tensions.
The American people can be confident that when it comes to China, the president is going to continue to stand firm until China steps forward and not only resets the trading relationship, but as I said, embraces those international rules of order that should govern all economic exchange.
Well, joining us now from New York is Justina Vasquez. She covers commodity markets for Bloomberg, and we've got her recent reporting at onpointradio.org. Justina, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So first of all, pick up where this tape from the vice president left off. Is China getting the message that the Trump administration is intending to put out with these amplified tariffs?
Well, it seems that they have definitely started gearing up kind of some of the rhetoric as well as some of the kind of tangible preparations that they can be making as far as if they do decide to limit restrictions or rather limit trade from their nation elsewhere, especially to places like the U.S. Or to places that supply the U.S. That's definitely a possibility that could kind of affect how the trade war could pivot from here.
Okay, so tell us more what you mean by that. What could China do?
Yeah, so I know a lot of folks recently have heard last week there was a visit from China's President Xi to a rare earth facility. There have been other similar preparations made as far as, just making sure stockpiles are ready, things like that, kind of the basic preparations that a government would need in order to be able to say, hey, we're self-sufficient and would be, supposedly economically well off to not to begin these restrictions on trade.
Okay, so we'll talk more specifically about rare earths in just a couple of minutes here.
Sure.
But I also understand that that we've got the G20 coming up in July, and China recently put out a policy paper that might be trying to open the door again, or perhaps reduce trade tensions between the United States and China. Any hope there?
I don't cover policy as much as I do the metals, but
Okay.
I do know that is definitely a deadline where a lot of these kind of questions are going to be coming to a head.
All right. Well, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we will refocus ourselves on these rare earth metals. But as for that policy paper, by the way, China said that it is not afraid, but it's still open to negotiations, and the door is open for the United States. But the Chinese Commerce Minister said the U.S. needs to bring out fair requests. Anyway, we're talking about the United States and China and trade wars and tariffs and this question of rare earth metals, which we'll explore when we come back. This is On Point.
It's 1965. A white minister is murdered in Selma, Alabama, but no one is held to account.
More than 50 years later, we return to the place where it happened to call a lie, and finally solve this murder.
White Lies from NPR. New episodes drop Tuesdays.
This is On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. We're talking this hour about trade wars, tariffs, and rare earth metals and the leverage that China might use in the escalating trade tensions between the U.S. and China. What do you make of the trade tensions between two of the largest economies in the world? Do you think additional tariffs are the way to go to open up Chinese markets and to change Chinese trade practices? We're at 800-423-8255. That's 800-423-TALK. I'm joined today by Justina Vasquez. She covers commodity markets for Bloomberg. So, Justina, let's focus now on those rare earth metals. First of all, what are they specifically, and why are they so important?
Yeah, they're a group of 17 minerals, kind of as you explained a little bit earlier, specifically the ones that seem to be having the major effect are the group of heavy minerals. So some of those are the minerals that go into electric vehicles, that go into drones, cars, wind turbines, and basically they kind of just help magnets and all these machines just work well and make them more efficient.
So that actually makes them then very essential and very common throughout many, many products that economies rely on. Like your smartphone has some rare earth metals in it. Mm-hmm. But they're not exactly rare, though, are they? It's just that they're difficult to process. Is that right?
Yeah, they tend to show up in kind of clumps of one another, so it makes them expensive to kind of mine one at a time or to kind of separate them from each other and just get them into a usable form. Since they're kind of spread out, kind of, like you said, commonly across the earth, but just all kind of clumped together.
Okay. So how is it then that China has such control over these rare earth metals if indeed they're not sort of geographically monopolizing the metals themselves?
Yeah, well, I guess part of it has to do with regulations. Here in the U.S., we kind of have tighter environmental regulations on how these things get mined. China, the restrictions aren't as strict, and so they're able to, along with just their geography of having a good supply of some of the ones that we care to use a lot, they also have some regulations that make them a little bit easier and more economically efficient to mine.
Okay. So I guess the ultimate question then is, if China indeed does decide to use this leverage that they have and restrict the exports of rare earth metals, I mean, how much of an effect would that have here in the United States? Yeah,
it looks like that the U.S. has roughly, I guess, a little bit over about 550 ounces, or rather tons of these minerals stockpiled by the government. The ability for us to get that from China, it seems like there's going to be a gap here in the time between when the U.S. can kind of ramp up production. We've got just one mine here in the U.S. that mines these. It's out in California in Mountain Pass, and they have recently, they're going to upstart one of their mines, and it won't be kind of up and running until sometime in 2020. So there's going to be a little lag in production. So that's kind of where the biggest effect is coming from, is just trying to ramp up domestic production of these minerals so that we won't be so reliant on places like China.
Okay, well, Justina Vasquez covers commodity markets for Bloomberg, joining us from New York today. Justina, thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, we are talking about rare earth minerals and China's threat to restrict exports of those rare earth minerals to the United States in retaliation for amplified trade tensions between the U.S. and China. We want to know what your question is. We're at 1-800-423-8255. That's 800-423-TALK. Well, joining us now from South Bend, Indiana, is Eugene Goltz. He's a rare earth expert and associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Also a former engineer, he specializes in the intersection of the economy and national security. Eugene Goltz, welcome to On Point.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Also with us from St. Louis, Missouri, is James Kennedy. He's president of 3 Consulting. He owns the Pea Ridge Mine near Sullivan, Missouri, an iron ore mine that is rich in rare earth minerals. He's been pushing for the creation of a U.S.-based cooperative market to make the U.S. and its allies self-sufficient in the refinement of rare earth minerals. James Kennedy, welcome to you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you both. So, Eugene Goltz, first of all, can you just explain to us or explore with us why there are national security implications to China saying it might restrict rare earth mineral exports? Why has the Pentagon been concerned about this for some time?
Well, the thought has been that many systems involved in national defense, weapon systems, and other systems incorporate components that involve rare earth materials in some way. So rare earths, as was mentioned earlier on the show, are useful for certain kinds of magnets, and magnets are important in a lot of electronic components. Rare earths are also useful in some laser and sensor systems separate from their magnetic properties, and in display systems that are used in a lot of weapon systems. In fact, many weapon systems use them in very minute quantities. And so the thought was that our ability to produce these weapon systems would be reduced if we couldn't get a hold of the rare earth material or the components that are made from rare earth material.
Has China ever before, I think if I can remember correctly, at least once before, has used the threat of restricting rare earth minerals on trading partners? Has that has happened before?
So not just the threat, but in 2010, in the midst of a controversy over ownership of some small islands in the sea, China suspended exports of rare earth materials to Japan. And at the time, they didn't issue an explicit threat where they said, do what we want on the islands or else we're not going to start up the rare earth trade anymore. But it was well understood by many people. And in fact, later, the Chinese government did acknowledge that they had used rare earth materials in a bargaining relationship for their political goals.
Okay. So I think I still want to try and get to an understanding of how much of an impact it would have in the short run if China did, for lack of a better term, sort of weaponize its control over processed rare earth minerals. For example, here is a clip from CNBC. You're going to hear James Litinsky, co-chair of the Mountain Pass Materials Mine in California. He told Andrew Ross Sorkin, co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Box, that China's recent hints that it could stop exporting rare earth minerals is both good for some U.S. businesses and bad for some businesses.
Is this a lucky moment for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a stroke of luck in the medium and long term, but in the short term, we have a lot of challenges, and we need to.
And the challenge for you guys just being that while you mine here, you're exporting to China.
That's from CNBC's Squawk Box. So James Kennedy, help us parse that. I mean, can the U.S. very quickly ramp up its production of processed rare earth minerals to counteract a Chinese export ban?
No, the answer is no. The problem is it's never been a mining or resource issue. The United States historically got most of its rare earth materials, and particularly heavy rare earth materials, as a byproduct of some other mined commodity. So the entire history of rare earths and tech metals was based on a byproduct resource that never was priced very high. It wasn't very profitable. That all changed in 1980 when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the IAEA changed some of the regulations around mining and source material, and that terminated the production of byproduct heavy rare earths. And from that point on, the entire value chain, which is the people that take the mined material and the purified oxides and turn them into magnets or garnets or other metals and alloys, they just packed up and left. They all ended up in China. So it's not so much the resources. We have the resources. We dispose of the resources because of a poorly thought out regulation. The issue is the value chain. And so opening up one new mine or 10 new mines is never going to do anything to solve the problem, because all that material will be shipped to China to be converted into something useful.
Okay, so then what steps would solve the problem?
So the problem is policymakers and so-called experts in this field fail to recognize that China's running a multi-level monopoly. And the way this works is they can price rare earth mined materials, rare earth oxides, rare earth metals, alloys, magnets. They can set the price anywhere, so they can bankrupt any competitor anywhere in the value chain. And because of this, Japan and the U.S. have failed to build a value chain, because you have to build a value chain on an uninterruptible supply of resources. So China's got us coming and going. And what does that allow China to do? It allows China to control the value-added materials, and that allows China to force technology companies to move their manufacturing inside China. This is the game.
Eugene Gholtz, you want to respond to that?
Sure. So I just don't think it's true that the entire value chain has moved to China, or that it would be impossible to, even in the relatively short term, process rare earth material in the United States. So at all levels of the value chain, there either is or has recently been, and the capital assets currently exist and the know-how currently exists, ability to make rare earth products in the United States and certainly outside of China. So it currently is the case that given kind of normal prices and the current tariff levels, it has made sense for the Mountain Pass mine to ship rare earth concentrates to China for the next step in processing. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't under a different circumstance, either process them here in the United States, they understand the chemistry and they have the equipment, or process them in Estonia, where they recently processed them, or process them at other facilities in the world. There is a facility in the United States operating that makes rare earth metals from oxides in Arizona. There are magnet companies that make magnets from the rare earth metals. There are motor companies that make motors from magnets. Like every stage of the value chain, just because in normal times it makes sense to produce some of those things in China or Japan or Estonia or wherever else, doesn't mean that if someone disrupted the market, there couldn't be someone else. In fact, there are lots of people who are waiting. That's why Litinsky said that there was some luck in this situation, is the disruption or the potential disruption reshuffles the market a little bit and gives them an opening to expand production, make more money, do well.
Okay, so I have to say, I want to distill this conversation down to a couple of basics here, because I'm going to be honest, I'm still not quite sure I understand what's driving the big concern here when China says it could restrict rare earth exports here. So I mean, Jim Kennedy, do you want to just help walk us through this? Because I'm hearing a sort of a divide between what you and Eugene Goltz are saying about the United States' ability to make up for the production if China does restrict the exports.
Sure. Eugene is confusing laboratory work and small-scale production that has no commercial capability with capability. The fact is Mountain Pass never in its entire history produced rare earth metals. They don't have the capabilities. When he refers to companies in the United States that make magnets, those magnets are made from base metals that are shipped here from China. This is a fact that the CRS, the Congressional Research Service, and the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, have confirmed. So there is no ability to produce commercial quantities of these materials. We do have a few quote-unquote fabricators that buy Chinese materials and then upgrade them. They stick a stamp on them. They cut them to a shape. But the fact is the United States of America is 100% import dependent for all rare earth metals from China, and we're not going to build a value chain in a week or a month or 6 months. In fact, the GAO estimated it could take up to 15 years.
What about the non-Chinese processing facilities that Eugene Goltz was talking about?
Well, there isn't. I mean, so here's how it works in the real world. Right now, the only other country in the world that has commercial quantity production of rare earth metals is Japan. Japan produces about 25% of its internal needs, which makes it 75% dependent on China, or let me say 72% dependent on China, because in Vietnam and Estonia, which is not operating because it's not economic, and other little facilities around the world make up the other 3%, but China essentially owns and controls over 95% of that production. So that leaves like 0.5% of global production available for the rest of the world to compete against. These are the realities. Pretending that this is about mining or pretending that we're just going to throw up rare earth metallurgical facilities is silly, because the fact is China can set price anywhere.
Well, so
China can bankrupt all of them.
We're going to have to take a quick break here in a second, but I wanted to give Eugene Goltz a chance to respond to that.
So the facilities I'm talking about are not lab scale pilots, bench scale research facilities. They're commercial production facilities, in some cases run by relatively small companies, in some cases run by large companies. The Japanese, metal production, magnet production using rare earth oxides that are currently processed to the oxide phase in China. They also, Japan imports substantial oxides from Malaysia that are mined in Australia. I mean, there is lots of flexibility in this market of things that could adapt and things that are already producing commercially for commercial intent. Quite a bit of the Chinese production today is either Japanese or Canadian companies that have plants in China. It's not that they don't know the trick or don't have the intellectual property to do it somewhere else. They just are choosing this right now, given the current situation, and have facilities elsewhere that could do it if need be.
Well, we are talking about rare earth minerals and China's near monopoly on these important metals in many, many products and manufacturing processes around the world, especially here in the United States. This is On Point.
The fact that in 2019 we're having this debate about measles vaccine makes my head want to explode.
We're just in this really strange place, and the only people speaking up are the parents.
Endless Thread, the podcast from WBUR, Boston's NPR station, and Reddit, brings you a special series on the history of vaccines and anti-vaxxers.
Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
When's the last time you had a really good workout? Not of your biceps, but of your brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam, host of Hidden Brain. Listen every week and flex your mind.
This is On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. We're talking about trade tensions between the United States and China and about rare earth minerals as well. I'm joined today by Eugene Gholz. He's a rare earth expert and associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. James Kennedy joins us. He's president of 3 Consulting, and he owns the Pea Ridge Mine near Sullivan, Missouri, an iron ore mine, that is rich in rare earth minerals. And let's go to our callers who have been patiently waiting. Let's start with Zach in Davenport, Iowa. Zach, you're on the air.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, it sounds like China's able to run wild with their prices, I'm presuming because they're, state-run and supported by the Chinese government. If Trump is using his protectionist and isolationist ideas, is it possible, is there any indication that Trump is leaning towards a state-funded rare earth metal plan in order to prop up its own ability to create rare earth metals? That's the end of my question.
Right. Zach, thank you so much. So Eugene Gholz, any indication from the White House about longer-term planning on rare earths?
Well, I think it's actually shorter term rather than longer term. The White House has, or both the White House, the Department of Defense, and other parts of government have talked about a number of tools they have to invest in rare earths. So in response to Executive Order 13806, a report was released last fall that highlighted a sense of vulnerability on national security grounds in the United States to rare earths. I think the more we talk about rare earths as a potential national security threat, that allows the president to potentially trigger some aspects of American law to allow him to put tariffs in place or use subsidies on national security grounds. If he couldn't get tariffs through Congress or something like that, this allows him to do it. The more he talks about it as a national security issue, the more he can do things unilaterally. Just last week, under something called Title III of the Defense Production Act, they started a process to invest in creating capacity to produce rare earth magnets in the United States, or to expand capacity, since the capacity already has been created in the past. And I don't myself see a reason why it would be essential for the United States to have a state-owned industry. It's sort of not the American way, or a state-supported industry. But I think Zach is exactly right that one thought is to use, for people who are inclined to be protectionist or people who are inclined to have the government involved in American industry, they want to use the potential rare earth threat as a lever to adopt to their policies to have a big government role in the American economy.
Well, James Kennedy, let me turn back to you, because you have championed the idea before that the U.S. create a U.S.-based cooperative to refine rare earth minerals. So not necessarily state-owned, but a business cooperative. Have you made any progress on that front?
Yeah. So, look, the situation reflects market failure. When defense contractors have to apply for a national security waiver so they can build F-35s or Tomahawk cruise missiles, when technology companies like Apple were forced to go to China to build their phones, this isn't market-based action. This is people surrendering national security or surrendering their IP control for access to these materials. Mm-hmm. So what we have is traditional, classic market failure due to a Chinese government-sanctioned monopoly that is supported at the highest levels of government. So what we did was we went to the Congress and the White House, and we proposed that the solution be how the United States solves market failures, and we have for hundreds of years. And it would be through the creation of a privately owned, privately operated, and privately funded rare earth cooperative, which could build a supply, an uninterruptible supply chain and value chain to metals and magnets and all of the other components, rare earth components. And so the United States could compete on scale, right? So the United States could have a fully integrated value chain and not have weaknesses in it where China can continue to deploy non-market maneuvers to take advantage of us.
Okay.
So, yeah, in fact, this is actually sitting in the White House. It's been there for 2 years. In 2014, it was offered as a bill in the House and the U.S. Senate.
But didn't get beyond that. Okay.
Well, nothing gets passed anymore. Regular way, unless you're part of an omnibus,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's go back. I don't mean to be dismissive about that. That is one of the major problems that affects everyone here in the United States. Yep. But point taken, James. Let's go back to the callers. Mark is calling from Knoxville, Tennessee. Mark, you're on the air.
Hi, thanks. I was going in a different direction. If we have an issue related to criticality with regard to the supply of these REEs or rare earth elements, maybe we can go in a place of trying to extract it out of the existing technologies. We have a half a generation of all these smartphones and everything that have these kind of rare earth elements in it. Can we recycle? Can we extract the materials out of I'm thinking of the 6 smartphones I've got in my drawer, and taking those out, and maybe it doesn't solve all the problem, but it begins to kind of see if we can get to a place where we can recreate the supply. Maybe there's some private opportunities there for extracting from the phones rather than extracting from the ground.
Mark, thank you so much for your call. Eugene Goltz, can we recycle what's already in our phones?
The problem with phones, recycling phones, is that there's a tiny bit in each phone, and there are many, many phones, and you'd have to collect a lot of them. But if there's, as part of a broader initiative to recycle phones or disk drives or compact fluorescent lights or any number of products that have bits of rare earth in them, if there's a way that for other reasons you're collecting all that feedstock, there are some scientific solutions to recycle material, and that's already being done. So at a very large facility in France, they have recently started to demonstrate recycling of rare earth materials at a small but commercial scale that is potentially expandable. Again, it depends. They have much stricter recycling rules in Europe, which gives them the feedstock that allows them to contemplate doing this.
Yeah. Well, I just want to recenter our conversation for a second around national security, Eugene Goltz, if I may, because we should note that China, even whispering about restricting rare earth exports, is in response in part to the United States threatening to cut supplies of U.S. technology that are needed by the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. I mean, this is a huge issue here because U.S. officials suspect that Huawei is in bed with the Chinese military. So there seems to be all of a sudden an emergent tension between two different aspects, critical aspects of U.S. national security, Eugene Goltz. Is it resolvable?
Well, I think the answer is yes, it's resolvable. So the United States has recently blacklisted Huawei, but we've resisted having Huawei equipment incorporated into the U.S. telecom network for a long time. It's perfectly consistent at the same time to say we don't want to buy and we don't think our allies should buy Huawei products, and also at the same time say we think there should be trade in rare earth products, but also to say rare earths are important, and we're glad that there is non-Chinese supply at all levels of the supply chain available. And it is the case that the United States has a number of high-tech related issues that are flashpoints in its current trade negotiation with China, and there are national security aspects of a bunch of those issues, so the word national security gets bandied around a lot.
Okay, so James Kennedy, it's also fairly easy to couch this issue of rare earths in these big, scary terms because of China's dominance in the processed rare earths market. I mean, I've seen you quoted in other media saying, for example, quote, China could shut down nearly every automobile, computer, smartphone, and aircraft assembly line outside of China if they chose to embargo these materials. Now, I suppose factually that's true, but practically speaking, would China even dare to do that? Wouldn't that shoot China in the foot itself by alienating every other major nation on planet Earth by doing so?
So, look, I'm glad you brought this up because most people seem to think that this is China acting in a Western-defined market, a market-defined reality. They're not. China is looking at the world very differently. So if you go back to 1997, the four leading figures in the Chinese Communist Party collectively created what was called the 16-character defense and industrial policy for the country. And it simply stated everything economic is military. And let's fast forward to 2017 when there was a national security law that requires every single Chinese individual, corporation, and entity to act in, collaborate with, and to help build the Chinese national security interests. So from an economic standpoint and from a social responsibility standpoint, every single Chinese person is building China up in a military-industrial way, but not for a conflict. They're way too smart for that. I think China would be foolish to use rare earths as an economic weapon. I think China would be very smart to use these materials against the United States at some point when there's a conflict. And let me put this in perspective.
Just got a couple seconds.
In 2017, when the United States inserted itself into the Syria situation, within just a few months, the United States, the Pentagon, was forced to admit that they burned through their entire global inventory of smart weapons. So what happens if we're in a real conflict with somebody else? That's when China would essentially pull this thing out of the bag. It's a very, very powerful weapon.
Well, James Kennedy, president of 3 Consulting, he owns the Pea Ridge mine near Sullivan, Missouri, an iron ore mine rich in rare earth minerals. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Eugene Goltz, a rare earth expert and associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Eugene Goltz, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
In a moment, Bill Nye the Science Guy and his advice for the class of 2019. This is On Point. Well, over the past several weeks, we've been listening to excerpts from some of the best graduation speeches in this commencement season. Educator, engineer, and TV host Bill Nye recently gave the commencement address to the graduating class of Goucher College in Maryland. And he told the students that their generation will have to do a much better job steering Spaceship Earth, as he called it, than their parents' generation has.
Now, you all are not facing a global war, leastways not yet. Instead, you're facing a global change in life itself. Our world is warming, and the living things around us are changing and dying at an unprecedented rate. So you are going to have to make big changes in the way you and your kids live. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, after James Watt came up with a very practical steam engine, we had about 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. Today, we have nearly 415. It changed by a factor of 1.5 in just 2.5 centuries. We're not talking about 2 million years, we're talking about 200 years. The only other times climates have changed this fast here on Earth are associated with the occasional asteroid impact. There's never been anything like it in all of human history. Now, when my grandmother, who grew up in Washington, D.C., went to see the Wright brothers' aeroplane fly in College Park, Maryland in 1909, there were a few more than 1.5 billion people on Earth. Today, there are almost 6 times that many. We are breathing and burning an atmosphere that's so thin. How thin is it? It's so thin. If you could drive straight up, you'd be in outer space in an hour. On 695, it would be 2.5 hours. Well, with every passing second, there are 4 more people born on Earth. By the time you all reach your billionth second on this planet, a little over halfway into your 31st year, we will have 9 billion people. We may have close to 10 billion people on Earth. Now we, by that I mean you, are going to find ways to feed us all. And you will, with technology derived from science and with policies that support innovation and investment in the greater good. Policies based on facts. It is no longer a matter of only keeping the air and water clean, curtailing the accidental creation of plastic trash, like straws, and hoping that we'll be okay. No. Nowadays, we, by that I mean you, are going to have to steer our spaceship, take charge of Earth. It's no longer a matter of just being good stewards. From now on, we humans will have to deliberately control what we do to our atmosphere, the land and sea, to ensure that we maintain as much biodiversity as possible while taking care of all of us. Now, when it comes to changing the world, don't be scared. Don't freak out when you have to perform doing anything, be it the final exam, dressing for a date, winning a world war, or managing a planet. You might be nervous. You might be scared. And that fear can stop you cold. But don't let it. As we say in the theater and on television, take that fear and turn it into excitement.
Bill Nye speaking to the class of 2019 at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland. We've got a transcript and a link to a video of his full address. It's at onpointradio.org. I'm Meghna Chakrabarti. This is On Point.